Morning? Not on yet. Hi, Dee Dee. I think so. I asked for that to do a call on Friday, early or late. So hopefully, I haven't gotten a response yet. Oh, this is interesting. Who's here? Morning. Okay. Good morning. Today is Wednesday, January 22nd at 9:05. They're close, finally. 9:05 a.m. and I'll call the meeting to order. First, I'd like to introduce the board members and the staff. To my far left, Board Member Dee Dee Diadamo. To her right, Vice Chair Fran Spivey-Weber. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodak. And to her right, Board Member Steve Moore. Mr. Howard, will you introduce the staff that are assisting today?
Assisting the board today, Janine Townsend, and to my left, Chief Counsel Michael Lawford. To my right, Chief Deputies Karen Turgovich and John Bishop, and Eric Oppenheimer will be doing the staff presentation today.
Great. Thank you very much. I see a lot of new faces. We're happy to see you. A lot of familiar faces, and it's good to see you again. Just for our guests who haven't been here before, the emergency evacuation procedures in this room, just look for the lit exit sign nearest you. Remember, if you hear a noise that seems like an emergency sound, it probably is one. Go ahead, gather your stuff, leave the building. The staff will be convening in Cesar Chavez Park. That's where you need to be if you want to know when we get the all clear to come back. This meeting is being webcast and recorded. People actually do watch. There are a couple things to remind you, one of which I don't model very well during the meeting, which is you need to be quite close to this microphone. Pretend you're a rock star. See, it's better, but it's weird. But just know that's for the benefit, particularly of the viewing public. You want to be heard. The other is, please set any of your noise-making devices on stun so it doesn't interrupt the proceedings. I can demonstrate that now. So we're set. All right. Well, I think I'm supposed to open this as opposed to Tom. Okay, good. Well, as you know, this is a workshop on our groundwater concept paper and on the topic more generally. And before I ask Eric to go ahead and open with a brief introduction, I wanted to say a few opening observations of the many that could be made, and then I'll turn to board members if any would like to make opening comments as opposed to closing comments, or both, up to you. Just a couple of things. One is, I think I speak for all the board members when I say that the immediacy of the drought formalized in the governor's declaration last Friday, along with what we're seeing across the state and, frankly, what we see coming at us in the not-too-distant future with the projected impacts of climate change, it actually requires us all to come together as never before to think creatively and realistically about managing all of our precious water resources. Our surface supplies, like so many others and everything else, aren't limitless even in the good times. And as we feel the effects of a warming planet on the state's precipitation patterns, particularly with the prospect of the loss of snowpack storage, our ability to not only manage our groundwater resources, but to grow our storage capacity, not decrease it may well make the critical difference to the future of communities across the state who are lucky enough to have a groundwater resource. What will make more sense to more and more communities will be to grow and manage that storage capacity in their own backyards, in vastly expanding the capacity and the utility of distributed storage. So whether it's what's most important to you is having a good quality water supply free of contamination, having sufficient supplies for cities and agriculture, water to maintain riverine ecosystems, or all of the above, groundwater is going to figure prominently in that discussion. It's an issue and a discussion whose time has come. There's an awareness, there's a focus at the local level, in agencies, in the legislature, in the governor's office, on issues of groundwater management that span supply and quality issues. As I've said to some of you before in the context of this dialogue and in more informal settings, this is a conversation that is happening in bars and coffee shops across the state of California. I have had people come up to me and grab my arm in bars. I bet they've grabbed my arms in coffee shops too, but it hasn't been as memorable, to say, you got to do something. Just don't say, I told you so. And it is and I think that we've even superseded that conversation in the depth of conversation that's happening at the local level. And I want to emphasize the local and regional level because there is a long and proud history of regional leadership on stewarding water resources of all kinds, including and especially groundwater. There are other places where it's just been more difficult for a variety of reasons, whether it's a lack of authority, a lack of funding, a lack of a perceived need, the fact that jurisdictional boundaries don't match groundwater basins, et cetera. Whatever the reason, with no intent or no blame aside, it has been challenging. And so we are interested in figuring out what we ought to do, both at the state board level, but also how, as part of the state family, we can help move the dialogue along to figure out how to get the tools and the resources to the local level, and then figure out what the appropriate role is for the state board. As some of you realize, and have noted in your comments, this discussion is happening in a number of fora, not just here, including in the administration's draft Water Action Plan, which was drafted after our concept paper went out. And so, as some of you noted, there are some more sophisticated concepts in that paper than in our concept paper, and that just shows the value of the dialogue that we have been having. And there are discussions in the governor's budget, there are discussions in other agencies, whether through the drinking water program at DPH or in the proposed transfer to us, or in the Department of Water Resources in their Water Action Plan and other fora. So it is a ripe time. Today's workshop, to put it in context, is part of an ongoing conversation. That is not something people are always used to. They're used to our notice and comment regulatory process. Some people, even in our, I think, fairly carefully crafted concept paper, where we tried to talk a little bit about how this was an opening dialogue to figure out what our role ought to be, people noted, rightly so perhaps, that a lot of the words we used were laden with regulatory overtones, and perhaps that's because that's our vocabulary. We need to learn more vocabulary. There will be a role for regulators in this at some point, but the issue is figuring out how to be strategically smart and to use the variety of tools we all have, both legal tools and authority tools and financial tools, but also our human tools, to think about how do we solve this problem at the best location. And since groundwater, thank you, Tim. And since groundwater varies so dramatically, geologically, hydrologically, culturally, politically, you name it, psychologically, across the state, it is a ripe time for having that discussion. This is one of those, like, do what I say and not what I do on the microphone part. I also want to stress, as I hope we have in the paper and as we have in our conversations, that groundwater is managed very, very well in many places across the state. We want to learn from those examples and figure out how to share that understanding, or understand why some places were able to do it better than others. There are some places, as I said, where it's not, and we need to figure out how to be most helpful. But we are at that thoughtful, educate each other stage. On contamination, it's a different story, one where our authorities are far more clear, and where we have been moving into action, at least in the past couple of years, more dramatically than we had in the past. This is way too late in many people's minds and way too fast in others. But at least we appear to have universal agreement, at least I haven't heard disagreement, that our top priority as a state is to get safe drinking water to the many folks who don't, and you see a number of things in motion to try and figure out how to make that happen. That will be something we focus on as our top priority in the coming years across state government. It's a huge topic in its own right, and in some ways we could be doing 2 or 3 separate workshops on the topics that are contained today. But they are interrelated, so we're going to see how it goes today. And I think actually having you all from the different quadrants of our work in the same room should provide for an interesting day, and I encourage those of you who haven't yet to take a look at the comments that we've received, particularly those comments that come from people you don't know at all who work in a different sphere or sector, so you can get a sense of the various parts of the spectrum. I want to thank you for your feedback to date. The comments we've received so far are very thoughtful, and as you can imagine, across the spectrum. As I said, for some, we're moving way too fast. For others, it is unspeakably slow. For some, we should be taking a more aggressive regulatory stance, even on quantity. For others, we should stay completely away. Those are all valid criticisms and options, actually. And that said, I was struck by the number of people who actually gave us some nuanced suggestions on how we ought to be thinking in a more sophisticated way about this issue, and I'm going to ask for more. It is a very, very complex area with many levels. As I like to say in other contexts, it's like mastering level 4 on a video game and thinking there are only 4 levels. There are a lot of levels to this. So we're going to talk groundwater management, we're going to talk about groundwater surface interaction, we're going to talk about contamination, we're going to talk about our tools and about the tools that local authorities need to do this work. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but whether today or in the near future, I want to ask for 2 things in particular. One, that in this dialogue, we really, really try to listen to each other and see where the possibilities are. It is totally understandable and frequently the case that people go to what they're most afraid of. That's totally fine. And if that's all we do today and that's what people need to do, that's fine too, because we need to be aware of that. But I want to ask you to try and think about where the possibilities are to make progress together, so that in addition to restating the problems, which we know, we look at where successes are actually happening and figure out how to replicate those. And secondly, that we really, really, really try to figure out what the tools are that local folks need to be able to do this work at the local level, and that we all pitch in to try and get them those tools first. So we're hoping to hear from all of you today about the right mix of actions, and ultimately the concept paper that you're here to discuss is going to inform our actions as a board, but we can't know what the right mix is unless we really, really take the time to understand what everyone is doing, and more importantly, how all of those actions could fit together. So we're going to start with a panel format today after Eric opens that I think most of you are familiar with to set the stage. I know for those of you who may be here as individuals to speak afterwards, that may seem like you have to wait a long time, but in practice we've found that by pulling together panels of just some, there are many, some of the public that pull together in panels, we can set the stage for more thoughtful dialogue afterwards, and I hope you'll feel the same way about it. The first panel are 4 individuals that many of you are familiar with who are going to provide some background information and set the foundation for our discussions. The second panel is going to give some of our state agency partners an opportunity to highlight some of their efforts, and they're going to be followed by a series of panels that many of you have set up in response to our notice. I want to point out that the notice for this workshop listed a series of questions as possible lines of inquiry. I'm not going to read them all, but if there's any way someone can put them up on the screen behind me. Karen, do you think there's someone who can just do one slide of the question so we can flash it up kind of periodically, because I don't want to take the time to read all 6, but they echo to a certain extent the things that I said in my opening. We did get response to some of those questions in the comments, and we hope to get more today. We're also open to suggestion as to whether we have the right questions in the first place. We're very, very open. And then after those organized panels, we'll open it up for individual public comment. At the end of the day, my colleagues and I may provide some direction to the staff. We may want to digest, as we usually do, what we've heard today, go back and read the comments again in the light of what we've heard today, and we'll set up some briefings with staff to determine our next steps. And so again, we are open to suggestion as to what those steps ought to be as well. So I want to just emphasize that we're not actually making any decisions today. Again, frequently in a regulatory context where people are used to notice and comment, they always believe that we're about to make a decision and it's sort of speak now or forever hold your peace. Again, I just want to emphasize this is the first in a series of actions to help shape what it is we will do to figure out how to be most helpful, with our regulatory tools being just one option among many. Any other board members want to make opening comments? Okay. Terrific. Eric, take it away.
Good morning, board members, and thanks so much, Chair Marcus, for setting the stage so well with your opening remarks. As you pointed out, groundwater is an important, really a crucial part of our water supply and our future, yet we face some significant challenges with respect to groundwater management. Given the importance of groundwater as well as the challenges, the State Water Board, had directed staff to develop a 5-year work plan specifying the actions that we plan to take to address groundwater, by really focusing our resources and our authorities on what we view as the most pressing issues and challenges. So we set out to develop that work plan, and as we started, we quickly recognized that it was really difficult to identify the specific actions that we want to take in the future that are different than what we're currently doing, as well as prioritize those actions without the benefit of understanding what's already happening outside the water boards, as well as within the water boards on groundwater management. And also without the benefit of the collective knowledge that we see out there, without the benefit of public input. So that was really the impetus for the concept paper that's the subject of today's workshop, and that was really our initial first step, was to develop this concept paper really as a tool to solicit public input. And within the concept paper, we laid out a vision for effective groundwater management, as well as a framework including 5 key management elements. And my feeling is that we can use that vision and that framework, probably with some tweaks moving forward, to develop this longer term plan. Also in the concept paper, we laid out a series of actions that are currently underway here at the Water Board, and what we knew about that was happening elsewhere at the local level and with other state agencies. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that it was not a complete picture of what's happening, and we've learned that as we've received comments on the concept paper. Additionally, we put forth a series of potential future actions that we could take moving forward, as well as recommendations for others. So with that, the work plan, as I mentioned, was really or the concept paper was really a tool to solicit input on our initial set of ideas and to get comments. And I'd say it was a very successful tool in terms of engaging the stakeholders, and I think the turnout at today's workshop is really a testament to how engaged folks are on the issue. We received a lot of comments, over 200 individual commenters with more than 90 unique comment letters, and we heard from a wide range of different interests, including environmental groups, water districts, cities and counties, agricultural representatives, private citizens and rural residents, and environmental justice advocates. So we really did hear from a good scope of different perspectives. Also wanted to mention that we held a series of 12 what we called focused stakeholder dialogues. And so in the concept paper, we invited people who were interested to meet with us, and some of you actually participated in some of those workshops, and they were quite useful in that they weren't one-way dialogues. putting out a concept paper and then getting comments is great, but it was nice to be able to meet with people one-on-one and provide clarification as to what we meant on certain things, and to hear from them what their feedback was in more of an informal setting, and those were quite helpful. We try to meet with everybody that we could that contacted us. We reached out to some people reached out to us, and it was quite useful. I don't plan on trying to summarize all of the comments that we received in the comment letters. I don't think that would be the best use of time. But I did want to go through a sampling of some of the common things we heard and just give you an idea of the types of comments we received. So first off, we received a lot of general support for the vision and framework that and the 5 key management elements that were embedded in the concept paper. I don't want to say that we had full support or unanimous support, but there was quite a bit of support. Probably one of the most common things that I read over and over as I read through the comments is that we need more emphasis on the connection between groundwater and surface water, and we need to recognize better that explicitly that pumping of groundwater is going to affect surface water flows. We heard a lot of support for local management, but in different ways. Some people essentially felt that local management is sufficient and we should let it run its course, while others felt, yes, they agreed local management is efficient and it's the way to go, but there needs to be transparency, accountability, and triggers for actions, including state actions. We received a lot of comments on thresholds, that thresholds needed to be set not only to achieve safe yield, but to achieve sustainable yield, that is to protect surface water flows, not just to sort of balance balance recharge and pumping as you might traditionally think of when you think of safe yield. But we also heard that the thresholds for groundwater quantity specifically need to be flexible and recognize that in areas of the state we're going to be exercising groundwater basins, drawing them down in dry periods and recharging them during wet periods. So static thresholds, as you might traditionally think of, probably are not the way to go. At least that was a comment that we heard. We heard that we should be focused exclusively on unmanaged basins, and we heard we should be focused on problem areas, but we also heard that if we do that and we don't focus on areas where basins are in good conditions, we're not going to be protecting those moving forward, and those might be the future areas where we have problems, so that might not necessarily be the best approach. We heard from quite a few people that we need just more definitions of terms within the concept paper. We throw out terms like high use, high priority, hydrologically vulnerable, local, regional. So, they were put out there as a concept, but I think it is a good comment that, we need to provide some definitions so people know know better what we're talking about. We also heard quite a lot that we need to define what we mean by state oversight and what the state's role potentially could be. But I need to say that there was highly variable perspectives on the degree as to which folks thought that the state should be involved with addressing groundwater quantity. And that's really kind of a high overview sampling of the types of comments we received. There were a lot more than that. I know you read a lot of the comment letters. We've been in the process of going through them and cataloging and reading and rereading, and we'll be looking at those more closely. I just quickly wanted to mention, in terms of from a staff perspective, what we're thinking in terms of next steps is to basically consider all the input that we've received in the comments, the input that we hear today, any direction today or in the future that we hear from you, the board, and to finalize the concept paper over the next couple months, sort of to memorialize it. And then from there, use the concept paper as a springboard to move forward with developing the longer-term 5-year plan that at this point we're really thinking would be focused on the specific actions that we would take at the water boards. So, that's mainly what I wanted to cover. Unless there's questions, probably we could move into the first background panel.
Excellent summary. Also, some good comments about not doing duplicative monitoring. I noticed that a lot more than it was a lot. But thank you. That was a great summary. Well, let's move into the first background panel then. I think you're right, Eric. And this panel, I'm sorry, Karen, I brought the one that doesn't have the time frame.
Would you like me to?
Do you have? Yeah, why don't you go ahead and...
The first panel is essentially a background panel that we wanted to pull together to provide context for this meeting. The panelists, and I'll ask that they come up and sit up here up front, but Paul Landis with the Department of Water Resources, Jay Famiglietti with, and hopefully I pronounced that right, with UC Irvine, also regional Santa Ana Regional Board member, Dan Wendell with the Nature Conservancy, and Miranda Fram with U.S. Geological Survey.
Great. And how long do we have for this panel?
Well, we're thinking with questions from you all, about 20 minutes a person. So 15 minutes presentations times 4 is an hour, and then, you know, add another maybe 15 to 20 minutes if you have questions.
Okay. Terrific. Just so they know what to do on the timers. I will say that throughout the day there is really no need to take all the time that's allotted unless you really, really need to. We are doing a survey course today, it seems. Thank you.
Paula, why don't you... Can you bring up Paula?
All right, and I want you to know that whoever's sitting next to you is deputized to help you the way Tam helped me, so that if you're, that way you don't have to wait for us to say something. Just if your colleague is getting too far away from the mic, just pull their mic closer to them.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much for having us here today and for giving me the microphone instructions, because I'm guilty of that as well. It's a pleasure to see many of you board members who I've known for a long time. And I'm actually filling in today for very talented staff who are around the state doing good groundwater work with our CASGEM, California Groundwater Elevation Monitoring Program, and I will touch on that. My role on the panel today is to give you a statewide overview of, and I will maybe go to my slide. Okay. Aha, good. Not the red button. Okay. I'm going to touch on use and supply monitoring, the kind of monitoring that we collect, the trends and management. One of the challenges we have always had in the Department of Water Resources, as with other agencies, is many of our programs that have to do with planning are general funded, including our data collection. And our data programs have been cut significantly over the years. And now we're at a point where people are saying, where's the data? We need to know what's going on. And that is not something you can go back and gather. So every year we try to get that funding restored with, I was going to say varying degrees of success, but actually with no success for the most part.
We are familiar with that dynamic.
I'm sure you are. So in terms of talking about groundwater, it is generally broken down into these 10 hydrologic units, which each have their own challenges and dynamics. And as you can see, within each of those 10 areas, there are sub-areas. So in managing groundwater and surface water, those are, we encourage looking at them at the local regional level, because while we have statewide concerns, the management and the knowledge and the uniqueness lies at the region levels. So in use in California today, about 40% of the supply in the state comes from groundwater, and there's a map of the state where you get an idea, the blue bar being the total water use and the green bar being how much of that use is groundwater. And the four largest areas of groundwater use also have the highest use in general: Tulare Lake, San Joaquin River, Sacramento River, and South Coast. This is one of the charts from our California Water Plan, and what I would point out with it, and maybe this red area will work for that. No. Okay. On the left is groundwater use by percentage compared to overall use, and then on the right it's the same but in terms of acre feet instead of percentages. But the significance, I think, of this graph is that it starts on the bottom with 2002, goes up to 2010, and you can see that over time the percent of groundwater use changes dramatically, but in general, with the exception of a couple wet years, it's going up. So in 2002, about 81% was groundwater, and in 2010 it was over 100%.
Can I interrupt you just
Uh-huh.
a second? Because this will be for the whole panel. I'm listening very hard for how we know this. You know, how we know what the groundwater numbers are, and you know what's the easiest, cheapest, best way to, if we don't really know, to get there. So I'm letting all of you know.
Well, good, and actually I'll just move right on because that is what I wanted to touch on. I just wanted to, thank you, go over the use a little bit, but as I said, our data collection programs are often shortchanged, but we do have an awful lot of data, and I'll go through that a little bit now. You see up here two maps. The one on the left shows where groundwater data is collected based by the agencies that collect it, and we have a number of partners in that. And then on the right, it's by the type of well, if it's domestic, irrigation, monitoring, public supply, etc. So you can see there is a great deal of data that is collected by varying agencies and varying use. One of the most valuable resources we have, I think, are these well completion reports, which DWR has been collecting for decades. The information we get is the type of the construction, the sealing, the details of the perforations, and in most cases the water level as well. Our system for collecting this information is quite primitive. It's handwritten, and I won't bore you with or awe you with an example of what these well logs look like, but they're pretty primitive. We have something like 800,000 or close to that. Many of them have been scanned and are searchable, but not digitized or in a database. In addition to that, the well logs are confidential in that you can only access them if you're a public agency or if there's permission provided by the well owner.
I have a question. What triggers the report being sent to you?
What triggers when a well is drilled? It's a requirement of the well drillers.
Domestic included?
Yes, all wells. So whoever the company is that has the equipment to drill the well knows that they are required to provide us with a well log. And here's just a sampling of well logs, that well completion reports, we call them WCRs, by hydrologic region and type of use from 77 to 2010, and you can see there's over 430,000 collected there. Domestic, irrigation, public supply, industrial, and monitoring. And here gives you an idea of how when wells were drilled and what type they are by hydrologic region. And I want to compare this chart, though, because if you'll notice there's, again, the types of wells, domestic, irrigation, etc. But this is a detail of just one of the hydrologic regions, the Sacramento hydrologic region. And I wanted to point this one out because if you look back here, before 1983, there is very little of the red, which are monitoring wells. And you see, as time goes on, the number of monitoring wells increases. So, Francis, to your question, how do we know these things? People are realizing it's important not just to have a well for supply, but to actually put wells in to monitor and see what's happening. And in 1980, DWR produced Bulletin 118, which there have been many, many requests that this be updated, and granted that's pretty old. But that looked at the basins in the state, and at that time we said there were 12 basins with critical overdraft, and 30 years later they're still having the overdraft. So we continue to collect the data, but the actions don't change. And here's another example of the groundwater trends, and these are 4 charts from 4 different locations, different types of wells, unidentified irrigation, municipal, and you can see that the time periods are, 21 to 2010, et cetera. But in general, with one exception here, the wells are all, the water level is decreasing dramatically. And here's another example of that, showing the depth to groundwater in a map where you can grasp better where the major pumping is taking place, or the lack of replenishment is taking place. Again, change in storage, both by a graph and a map. And a consequence of groundwater pumping is, of course, land subsidence, which was very huge in the Central Valley, especially the San Joaquin Valley, prior to the state and federal water projects bringing in surface water. And that slowed the subsidence dramatically. But now that surface supplies have been less reliable, and so has our rain and snowpack been less reliable, the subsidence has accelerated again in some areas to the tune of 2 feet a year. So back again to the data and our funding. I am thrilled to say that we did get a BCP through this year for our CASGEM program, as we call it, California Statewide Groundwater Elevation Monitoring. And with that BCP, we also got money for starting to develop a system so our well completion reports will be submitted electronically and at some point potentially be available electronically. So we're very, very excited about that. And we appreciate the support we've got from other agencies to get that BCP through. So this program came out of SB 2X. This was SB 2X 7-6 specifically, which was in 2009. And it also came with no money, but we were able to scrounge some up, and staff have done a fabulous job of looking at all of the groundwater basins around the state. Part of this program requires that the data we collect be readily and widely available to the public. It's a voluntary program, but there is kind of a large stick, which is if entities are not participating in this program, they're ineligible to complete for grant programs, not just with DWR, but any throughout the state that are related to water. So things that we have done, we have 171 basins are represented by a monitoring entity. These entities volunteer and then they're designated. We have close to 3,000 wells online. We have 45,000 groundwater readings, etc. You can read the stuff on the chart, but the point is we're making a lot of progress getting information and getting it voluntarily and getting it accessible. And we are combining this with our water data library, which the water data library has information from all of the agencies that provide data. We put it in one location for the public, and our CASGEM wells are part of that. So of the basins that we have participating in CASGEM, the pink are fully or partially monitored. We have categorized the basins in terms of priority based on the number of wells, the number of people, etc., and the reliance on groundwater. And so of the high and moderate use basins, the ones in orange, we still have yet to have entities step forward and be the monitoring. And then the other basins are low use, and we are not focusing on them at this time. In addition to collecting the data, attempts to encourage good groundwater management is these groundwater management plans, which are required, again, to get funding. And many of the groundwater management plans We have 119 of them, and you can see by the map, again, I kind of like the pictures rather than the numbers, despite the fact that I'm an engineer. You can see the percent of the state that's covered by groundwater management plans and those that are not. And again, if you look back to the last slide, the blue, the low use, low priority basins are the ones primarily that are not covered by groundwater management plans again. So I think the overlap there is significant or important to point out. Just another slide on the percentage. This is something that Aqua worked with DWR on to see things that are working and things that are not working. Limited funding, physical limitations, limited data and analysis, groundwater policy, and public involvements. Those are all things I think that people in the room here today can maybe help to improve. Oops. Other types of management besides the groundwater management plans are conjunctive management programs, and there are, you can see there's almost 90 of them throughout the state, and you can see where they're located, and this is where there is a very conscious effort to use surface and groundwater combined. I know you see along the east side of the valley here a lot of those blue dots, and that is where the Friant unit of the Central Valley Project is, and that, when it was established in the early 60s, was right off the bat established as a conjunctive use management area. So when surface water is available that's not needed for irrigation, it is used for recharge. And another way to manage groundwater basins is adjudication, which is something you know well, much better than I do, but you know that it is not easy to get in a basin adjudicated, nor is it easy to manage and monitor once it's adjudicated, but it is very specific in how the groundwater is managed. I'll go back to that for a moment. One of the things that DWR and in particular the Division of Integrated Regional Water Management does is we provide water master services for both surface water and the adjudicated basins. So in conclusion, there's a lot of monitoring going on. We are doing a good job of aligning our data collection with other agencies, getting it in an accessible, source database. The access to the data, some of the data, we are working on getting it accessible, at least in terms of the hardware and software, but then the confidentiality side of that is another challenge. There are challenges with modeling groundwater. We may have a lot of wells, as you see, and we have a lot of monitoring wells, but they may not be in the locations we need to give us a really accurate model. We do try to take that into consideration, but again, we're limited by our funding and staffing. Something that you mentioned in your, I believe in your plan, but I know it's come up with the regional board levels, is the interaction between groundwater and surface water. That's something that's very, very important to the Department of Water Resources for, in particular, our water transfers program. And collaboration is going to be really important, particularly in this critical water year. And we see we see efforts to make that happen, and we also see things happening independently that may not be really conducive to having effective groundwater management. So, thank you.
Thank you for that excellent overview. I know you have a wealth of data because I've been going through it recently, so excellent choices. Thank you. I wish I'd seen that before I gave the presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago. Terrific. Next, Jay, you are up. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wearing your professional hat as opposed to your volunteer professional hat.
That's right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Paula, for that presentation. I have a number of questions. We can connect later, or maybe during the question and answer phase. What I want to discuss is some of the work that we've been doing with satellites, actually, over the last 15 or so years, and it's really come to fruition, I would say, in the last 5 or so years. The first decade or so was really on proof of concept and developing the algorithms, and then over the last 5 years or so, our data record has increased in length to almost to over 10 years, and we've been able to see some very interesting trends that I think that we need to pay attention to. But before I get going, I do want to emphasize that there is no substitute for a robust ground-based network of monitoring wells. And Paula also mentioned the lack of funding to support modeling. We really need to use it all together: the data on the ground, the computer modeling, and the remote sensing that I'll be talking about. And I think this group in particular, I'm sure, is in agreement that it's an important step for us to be taking. I'll talk primarily about a satellite called GRACE, and GRACE stands for Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. It's a NASA mission that was launched in 2002.
Is that Sandra Bullock in that picture?
No, but people tell me that I look like George Clooney. So you can see that the satellites are not very big. Their orbits they're up about 400 kilometers, and they're separated by about 200 kilometers. So it was launched in 2002. It was supposed to only last for 5 years, but it's still going, giving us now about 10 months of data per year out of 12. A follow-on is scheduled for 2017, and hopefully the current mission will not crash before 2017 rolls around. I guess the easiest way to think about how this GRACE mission works is that it functions like a scale in the sky. And when there's more mass on the ground because of, say, more snow in the Sierras, then those two satellites are actually pulled down towards Earth's surface because there's more mass on the ground. So it's not unlike getting on a scale, right? If you get on a scale, scales are gravity driven. If you weigh more, you're pulled down towards the surface, where you compress the springs in your scale. Here, the thing that's changing is not springs, but the distance between the Earth's surface and the satellites. So when there's more mass on the ground, the satellites get pulled towards the ground. And it's that distance, it's the location of the satellites and the distance between the satellites that is used to physically map out the places all over the Earth that are gaining water mass, say because of a flood or because of a big snow season, or losing water mass because of a drought or because of things like groundwater depletion. It is not the be-all and end-all, and one of the there are a couple of important limitations. One, a couple are the space-time resolution. It is only good at monthly and longer time scales, and it's only good for large areas, about 200,000 square kilometers, 150,000 square kilometers, and greater. I'll show you some ways by which we can downscale it down to the scale of the Central Valley, but in general, we're talking about large areas and longer timescales with an accuracy of about 1.5 centimeters of water, which means the change in storage has to be bigger than that equivalent water height. I'm making it sound like the satellites move around quite a bit, but actually their movements are quite tiny. It's sub-micron level, so a micron is a thousandth of a millimeter. So the movements are quite small. So the technology, in short, is very cool.
So that's why 1.5 centimeters seemed big to you?
Yes, right, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so this is our most recent chart. And so we just got this on Friday, so this is literally hot off the press. What this figure shows us is the ups and downs of the total water storage, not just the groundwater, but all of the water in the combined Sacramento-San Joaquin River basins. So in a sense, it's telling us not how much water is there, but how the water weight, right? How the water storage is changing. All of the snow, all of the groundwater. And so let me point some things out. We had a pretty good drought from 2006 through 2010, and you can see that decrease there, right? We had a little bit of recovery in 2011, but since 2011, we're sort of continuing this longer-term drought, which when you look at this figure, you could arguably say goes back to 2006. The other thing I want to point out is that where this chart ends, it ends in just about November of 2013. That is, right, the second lowest point, one of the lowest points in the last decade in terms of total water storage in the combined river basins. So lowest point in nearly a decade. It's just a that was moving a little slowly. An animation of what the data look like on a monthly basis. I hope that it is not too painful to watch. So the colors, red is drier than average, and blue is wetter than average, and they're monthly data. So you can and it just goes from 2002 to 2008, so it's not a long time period, but you can see how we get some regional information out of here, and then towards the end of this time period, you'll see a little bit more red coming into play. These are the monthly ups and downs, not the long-term trend. I can't tell if that stopped or not, but anyway, I can give you access to these and other animations. Well, we don't do it just for California. We look across the whole nation and across the world. And this is a global map that actually, a U.S. map that was published in June, and shows the water storage changes, the trends in freshwater storage for almost a decade, 2003 through 2012. And we see some well-known hotspots, the Central Valley, the Southern High Plains, all across the southeastern U.S. Might be a little bit of a surprise to people, but if you live there, you understand that it's an issue. And we also see this stratification almost of the upper U.S. getting wetter and the lower U.S. getting drier, and that really actually fits into a bigger climate change picture of the wet areas getting wetter and the dry areas getting drier. And so we can combine looking at the time charts, the time series charts, with the map in this figure here, so you can get a sense for in those hotspots, which are represented by those first 5 charts. You can see that there's a fair amount of pretty steady decline in water availability. All right, and so just to compare to what we can see on the ground now. Paula had a much better figure than this, but this is the USGS Groundwater Watch. What Paula showed was a combination of many different data from many different agencies. I just wanted to make the point that what we do with remote sensing is quite complementary to the data on the ground, which is sometimes quite limited and quite difficult to construct a holistic picture like we can get from satellites. So, you can get this sort of picture from satellites versus, it takes a lot of work. And again, it's important work, and we have to do it, but it takes an awful lot of work to compile the groundwater data, to get it into a model, to calibrate the model, to do all the hard work that needs to be done. It's a ton of work. This is just one more piece of information that we can use to see what's going on, and we can use to constrain these models and make them better so we can do better prediction.
Can I ask you a quick question? And
Yeah.
Just a parochial thing of mine. Will you go back one slide?
Mm-hmm.
One more slide. What the heck is happening in Nebraska?
So I think they just have a lot of data,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So it's the northern
Actually,
part of
they
the...
have pretty extensive regulations, so they
Yeah.
have a lot of okay,
right,
thanks.
sure. So that's how we want California to look. Right?
Change the color of the
Right.
red
I mean in terms of the density of the wells, not the trends. Okay, so how do we get to one of these red spots and figure out how much groundwater there is? So that's a big research question that we tackle in our group, and really what this GRACE mission, I don't know if did I ever say what GRACE stands for? It stands for Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. It's a NASA mission. Sorry if I forgot that. So what we get from GRACE is this delta S total, the total storage change, which is this one number, this one weight change that says this is your combined weight loss or weight gain in snow and surface water and soil moisture and groundwater. And so if you want to split that up, right, so think about your own body. If you want to figure out how much weight you gained in your hand, you get on the scale, you figure out the total weight loss, and then you measure everything else and subtract it off. So you'd be left with what's, the weight of your hand, if that were possible. That's what we try to do with groundwater. So from the total that we see in this river basin here, all of the soil moisture, groundwater, surface water, and snow, we want to subtract everything else that's not groundwater. So the surface water, the snow, and the soil moisture to isolate the groundwater storage change. And to do that, we need data from other remote sensing, from data in situ observations on the ground, and we don't have anything else. We rely on computer models. So let me show you an example for the Central Valley. This was a paper that was published in 2011. So in the upper left, we have the time series from GRACE, the total water storage change, so the shortened version of the one that I just showed you. And from that, we subtracted the snow water equivalent, which we got from the Weather Service and has the snow survey data included in it, and surface water storage, which has reservoir storage, which we get from DWR, and soil moisture, which we don't really measure or don't measure enough to make a difference, and so we have to take it from computer models. So a definite shortcoming. But anyway, from A, we subtract B and C and D, and we're left with that orange time series in the upper right, which is the groundwater storage change. And I have I think I have a bigger plot. Right. So this was the final product, so to speak, of groundwater storage changes from 2004 through 2010. Blue line shows the overall trend. The red line show that the trends were piecewise, really not much happening pre-drought, 2004 to 2006. Then what happens? Drought, farmers have their surface water allocations cut, they pump a lot of groundwater, bang, water table drops way down, and the satellites can see that. In this case, the region lost about 20 cubic kilometers of groundwater in that 5-year period, and that's about 2/3 the volume of, to put it in context, 2/3 the volume of Lake Mead.
Where would you get the soil moisture measurement?
So there are ways to make the measurements. I mean, there's technology out there. It's just expensive. So there's time domain reflectometry. There's other there's actually some cosmic ray sensors that can do it now. There's been a lot of advances in GPS that we could take advantage of, but we don't really have a soil moisture network like we have a rain gauge network or like we measure stream flow. So I should mention that it was so we pioneered this work, and it was a big deal. To be able to remotely sense groundwater from space is a big deal because it's underground. Most satellites are looking at the surface, so getting some good coverage. This is an update we did, and I wrote it on another slide, preliminary update, because we really just got the new data on Friday. So this is, in the upper left, is that chart of the total that I showed you with that low point, which is right about now. And from it, we've done the same thing, subtract the snow water equivalent, which we get from the Weather Service and from the snow survey data, reservoir storage from DWR, still using the soil moisture models. And we get a groundwater chart that looks like this. And so if you look from 2006 through 2010, you see that drought period. But then we've had some recovery. Okay, so we can go home, right? Because there's no problem. And that's not true. And let me try to put it into context for you. We're sort of at the beginning of a drought. There's been some recovery, right? And so the groundwater has recovered a bit, but history suggests the following, at least for the GRACE time period. What I've done here is show the surface water storage change is shown in pink, so that reservoir data, and then the groundwater, our computed groundwater, shown in blue. So if you just look at the pink, you see this is what's happening with our reservoirs, and so there's some ups and downs, and right now they're headed from 2011 through 2014, headed towards and down. That blue line is our computed groundwater, okay? And so what you see is that the groundwater response lags the surface water response. So we are about, as we all, I think, are prepared to, are preparing for, we are about to see that blue line flop over and start heading down, right? So the groundwater response lags the surface water response. The groundwater response is a combined human and natural response. There would be that lag even if these things weren't managed. How long is it going to last? Well, we don't know, right? It depends on the length of the drought, and it depends on the water management decision. So the less surface water farmers have available, the more groundwater they're going to need to use for irrigation. Again, putting it into context, this is a long-term cumulative change from the USGS report that was published in 2009. That dark blue, almost black line going back to, looks like 1960, right up to about 2002 in this plot. The black line shows the cumulative water loss, cumulative depletion in the Central Valley, for the entire Central Valley. And so to add our data onto this, sort of looks like this. When we published that paper that came out in 2010, we were at that low point. Okay, so that's about 2010 in the dashed blue line, and then we've had a little bit of recovery. But when you look at that chart, you can see that the periods of recovery, the white periods are drought periods. Every time we go into a dry period, we have a pretty good drought. And so where the star is maybe where we are right now. And so we have to be careful about where we're going, because if, we know that we will be depleting our groundwater. It's not if, and so we're thinking about is how you can control that line, right, and the slope of that line. Just throw in some work from our group on the Coachella Valley showing groundwater depletion by decade in the 70s in the upper left, and these are from well observations, not satellites. 70s, 80s, 90s in the lower left, and the 2000s. So in spite of the big recharge efforts that are happening there, they show up as blue in the 80s and the 90s. The drought of the 2000s is really taking its toll. So that's something that that Brian Thomas and our group is working on. And I should have mentioned the updates to our Central Valley work were done by Stephanie Castle and J.T. Rager. Want to finish up with what's happening in the Colorado River Basin, because we need to think about where we're going to be getting water in the future, and this has been one of our go-to places. And this is again work from Stephanie Castle and her master's degree. Similar kind of study where in the upper right we see the change in total water storage in the Colorado River Basin. Okay, so in this time period, drought time period, 2005 to 2013. There's been a vast amount of water loss. And what the next two graphs show, accessible water is the combination of groundwater and surface water. So we're saying that soil moisture isn't really accessible and frozen snow isn't really accessible. We're just talking about water and reservoirs and groundwater. And we split those off in the bottom panel. And the red is surface water. The red is Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And the blue is groundwater. And so the take-home message of this figure is that while everyone is paying attention to the surface water, the groundwater is disappearing. Okay, and Willow's declining groundwater reserves in the Colorado River Basin impact the ability to meet future allocations to California. Don't know. So it's not just California. It's not just the Colorado River Basin. Not just the United States, but it's really all over the world. And so just to give you a global perspective, the good news is that we're not alone. The bad news is that we need to get on it. I did write this op-ed that came out in September on the need to manage groundwater. Some of the bullet points are, as this group knows, the end of abundance is over. We need to be thinking about managing our groundwater sustainably. As a scientist, I think the third bullet point is very important. Sound science has to underlie sound management. And the last one, education and communication are essential. And we're talking about reaching out to farmers and farm bureaus, to the general public, to you folks, to elected officials. I do think that we need to raise awareness of the state